Well, welcome to our March 16th edition of Structural Modeling video conference. Today, Kevin and I will be talking about the Structured Dialogue Playbook. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin.
Thank you, Joe. So we're going to talk about, we call it the STD Playbook or the Playbook. And the Playbook is a play on the term handbook, which was written by John Warfield and Roxana Cardenas back in the early 90s, the Interactive Management Handbook. And in the oeuvre, I think is the way you'd pronounce it, of Warfield and Interactive Management, they've separated books. They have a book on theory, a couple books on theory, which is the Societal Systems book from the early 70s, then many dozens of technical articles in IEEE journals and systems, general system science journals. And then they have the handbook. The Interactive Management Handbook is about the methodology. And then there's also case studies. And when people write their case studies, they typically take the results of the event. They describe someone who publishes an article of a case study describes the context of the event in a few paragraphs, will describe a summary of the methodology, and then they basically say what was the questions that were asked, and they present the results of the application. And they never talk about what the actual experience of the practitioner was. And the playbook is intended to fill that void and to talk about case studies from the standpoint of the practitioner and the host of the event or the client. And that's what this is about. The playbook has several motivating factors. And I'm going to switch over the screen share to me. Can you hand that off to me, Joe?
You've got it, Kevin.
Okay. So the formal name of this book is the Manual for Organizing Structural Democratic Dialogue Events. You'll notice that
you're not showing anything, Kevin.
No?
No, just your...
Okay. Let me try again. I'm hitting a screen share. Yep. Oh, maybe because my video was off.
There you go.
How about now?
No, just see your photograph.
You see my face?
Yep. Not a live one, just a picture.
Okay. Now,
now see your live face.
And now, if I hit screen share, the green box on the left.
Yeah, you should do that, and then select something. Screen share, and then select the document.
Yeah, that selection is not coming up. Why is that?
Well, I have the...
I see. I see. Okay. It was under some other windows.
Oh, okay. There we go. We got it here now.
So the name here, Structured Democratic Dialogue, is the term for interactive management used by the Cypriots. It's just a variation on structured dialogic design, which is a trademarked name for interactive management by the Institute for 21st Century Agores. One of the contexts here is the domain of science model. This is articulated by John Warfield in a paper in the Journal of General System Science, or whatever the name for it was at the time. And it's meant to be a cycle of, they have a theory, and I've mentioned where they have that theory, the book Societal Systems and the General Design Science books. The methodology, which is largely captured in the Handbook of Interactive Management by Cardenas and Warfield. And then applications. And when people do the applications, they typically publish it first as a report to the client, and then it goes through some scrubbing and comes out in a journal article, often in the content area or the subject area, and sometimes in the methodology related journals like a system science journal or the Journal of Applied System Science, things like that. Those journals are tired of seeing these types of publications where the same method that was developed decades ago is being employed, and all that's being reported is another result of an application. So, talking about the case study from the standpoint of the practitioner and how the methodology may need to advance is a key thing of interest to the journals. And if you look here at the bottom, between 5 and 6 o'clock, there's supposed to be a feedback from experience in the arena. They call it the arena, and I think that's a reference to a word employed by Charles Saunders Peirce, and the corpus, which includes the theory and the foundations of the theory from other fields. And this link is very, very weak, if not non-existent, in my opinion. And so we're trying to address that with the way the playbook is done. Includes whoops. That includes this link. Why do we want to do that? Because it costs, a lot of the events we do cost hundreds of thousands of dollars per event, and that's just a 3 to 5 day, maybe even 10-day event. So each data point to gather evidence to change the theory is extremely expensive. So we'd like to have people doing things in somewhat similar fashion so that we can collect up data and address the theory and foundations. I'm going to go to another page here. Okay. So oops. Hit the wrong button here. I launched the wrong app. Sorry about that.
Open Office. That's a good program.
Okay, so that's the domain of science model, and I'm going to talk about the motivating aspect of the model in terms of a specific case. And for that, I'm going to use just oral history for about 20 minutes. And I want to encourage you to ask questions along the way and make it interactive. So I'm going to try to switch so you can see my face, but it's giving me the recursion mirror in the mirror view.
Yeah, you need to select an application, not the desktop. Select the application window.
Did that work?
No.
Now we see your face.
in the Zen ink print behind you on the wall.
Helene, hello.
Hello, hello.
I'm not sure how to do this. So what do you see right now? The domain of science model picture?
No, we
you.
just see you.
You see me?
Yeah.
Yes, your face.
Okay. Good. So I'm going to share a case study. I've been working in theory and methodology and applications in this for a few decades, and I felt that we're really weak on sharing case studies from the practitioner and client's perspective. Most everything that's published in interactive management or structured dialogue is the results of the dialogue by the participants. And it's often presented in a methodology or a theory journal, and there's no news of changes to the methodology or the theory. Now, when we were in the 90s, mid 90s, there was a transition in interactive management and structured dialogue work from work in very large organizations to interorganizational work. To do projects that single organizations couldn't address, like patient safety. Patient safety cuts across medicine and pharmaceuticals and pharmacies and hospital management and quality control organizations and things like that. And there was at that time, no single organization addressing it. And so a small nonprofit that had been created by the American Medical Association, called the National Patient Safety Foundation, wanted to address patient safety in all the different domains of medicine. So how you use pharmaceuticals, how you do dialysis for people with kidney problems, how you handle patient safety in the emergency room or in the critical care unit. So all the different aspects, and they wanted to do planning events that would bring together all the major stakeholders and do it in a short amount of time for a little bit of money. So at that time, Leko Christakis, who had a consultancy called CWA, would typically go into, for example, the Food and Drug Administration, and they would plan an event. It was typically a 10 days of an event. And there'd be 5 days that would develop a problematique, which is a structured understanding of the problems. And then there'd be 5 days developing an action plan. And they would typically have 12 to 36 people in the room, more often about 24. And if the facilitation team was from within the organization and had already been trained, like it was at the FDA, they could do events with as few as 8 or 12 and afford to do it. But if you're bringing in an outside consultant, you can't afford to hire the team of consultants for interactive management to help only 8 people in the room, unless they're all presidents of a corporation. You have to amortize the cost of the consultants across more people. So that was one of the first things to do. If you want to reduce the cost per participant, you have to increase the number of participants you're dealing with, which increases the amount of time it takes to conduct an event. Now, if you're doing interorganizational work at a national level, it means everybody's going to fly in from somewhere, and they're going to be away from the home office. And if you have people that are representing the organization, they are typically director level or above, director or vice president. And they just do not leave for a week or 2 weeks at a time. So they wanted to do the problematique and the action plan 3 days max, not 10. So we needed to change that plan. And then the cost CWA was used to doing prep for an event over a period of 3 months to 6 months typically, and it was $200,000 to $400,000 per project, and the Patient Safety Foundation couldn't afford to do it for more than $40,000, so 1/10 of the cost. So we needed to regularize a lot of things and also make sure that the client did things to keep it off our plate. So we developed a collaboration with the client. It was intended that we would have a long-term relationship with the client, and that if we put some things together that were specific to the realm of patient safety, we would get to reuse that in later projects and therefore be able to reduce the cost. So, for example, if we conduct a literature review about what are all the different approaches to facilitating dialogue about patient safety that have been tried in the past, that would be good to know what has worked and what has failed. And if we did that for the first project, then we wouldn't have to do it for any other project. So we could wipe out the cost of doing that. So we presented a cost model that reduced in terms of prep time. Also, if we did more than one event in the same subject area. So we did a first event in safe use of pharmaceuticals. If we did a second event, say in patient compliance with pharmaceutical use, then it'd be much less expensive because we're very likely to be dealing with the same participants. So there's less time to teach the participants about what to expect with our method. There's less time to engage them for interviews because we don't have to explain as much. And so we estimated the cost reductions for doing multiple events within the subject. So there was a domain knowledge economy. And so there were a number of things like that. And so we regularized the learning curve for doing multiple events. Now, that's something that's not covered in the Handbook of Interactive Management at all. Handbook of Interactive Management kind of presumes there's one big event. And indeed, if you look at the history of many of the engagements of interactive management with Warfield and Christakis, everything's a big bang event, and they might revisit it 5 or 10 years later, but often not even there. There was about 8 organizations that internalized the practice, and then they could do they could do a 4-hour event because everybody just walks down the hall. You know, if you're in a big organization like the FDA or Ford, and if they had if they were big enough to create a reusable collaboration facility or meeting room, there was no prep time for the meeting room even. And as I mentioned to Joe before before we started today, there's been a drive over the past 20 years to make interactive management and as structured dialogue more accessible to community level organizations where they don't want to spend more than $5,000. And so, they want to do something in 2 days, and 2 days and a dinner engagement and a reception and a lunch. So the economics of doing structured dialogue have changed dramatically over the past few decades, and we haven't really learned how to reduce the cost for the community level work that well, in my opinion. The facilitators often have to step into the role of sponsor, which is unusual. And Warfield and Cardenas are very careful to differentiate the roles. a facilitator versus client versus sponsor versus broker. But at the community level, or even at the local government level, the client is not sophisticated enough. They're not rich enough. I mean, they're not sophisticated enough to do their own fundraising for the event. And so it turns out the facilitator helps them do grant writing, or sometimes the community level or government or nonprofit organization no longer has the domain knowledge, right? I mean, in the days of working with Ford or FDA, all the expertise is in those organizations. Now, if you're working with small nonprofits or small local government, it may be the case they're looking for the consultant to provide both domain knowledge as well as process for facilitation. And in the case of the National Patient Safety Foundation, we did this work over the course of a year to prep their first big event. We had 48 organizations involved. It was held at the Woodrow Wilson Peace Center in Washington. And the woman that ran it was great. She is a former nun, so she had a high degree of legitimacy, and she had run big parts of hospitals. And she raised $250,000 for participation in the project, paid us 40 when we asked for 75 and wanted 400. And they end up making money on us running the event. So it worked out brilliantly for them. And then they had a shakeup in their organization. And the following year, they lost more than half of their staff. And they were calling us for questions on domain knowledge about patient safety, because at that time, we had become it. We had become the the go-to people for their field of practice. And it is something that Warfield and Christakis always disavowed, having domain involvement by the facilitator, because that somehow violated their sense of neutrality. So even then, 20 years ago, we had that type of challenge to what Warfield and Christakis had kind of laid down as the way to go about things. And now that people want to do more community, there's a lot of call for doing dialogue at the community level, especially with nonprofits. And I think it challenges a lot of the roles that are outlined in the handbook. And so anyway, the key drivers was reducing cost, regularizing the flow of information from applications through case studies to change the theory and the foundations, like I was just suggesting, changing the notion of roles, who does what. I think that from there, I'll encourage you to have some discussion. It's kind of steamrolled over anyone that may want to have had some discussion. We're gonna have some time to speak. Let me
Well, that's very interesting, Kevin. I think that over a period of time, the technology for these types of events and activities has changed. And one of the things that we've been looking at is to understand if the functions of an event can be achieved over a longer period of time, if they're encoded into a kind of a self-service online process. You still have an event where people have a learning event, but they do a lot of pre-learning and a lot of normalization of concepts and so forth, a little bit at a time over a longer period of time before the event. And that seemed to me to be a very interesting approach. I know when I worked in the .com areas back in the .com days, that was one of the one of the mantras of the people there was said that basically you just want to send a few questions out, maybe one or two a week, and to get people to respond, and then you see what they're concerned with, what they do, and what they select, and then you kind of do a low-level response to engage the people. And so even in their day-to-day operations, as you're preparing a group to go toward an event, I think there's much more role for technology, which is just ubiquitous these days, to support that and to reduce cost.
Yeah, I think that's a big another transition besides trying to take what was a very robust methodology, but extremely expensive for small organizations, and going down to the community level. Another big transition is how to do the deliberations using the internet at a distance over a longer period of time. And I don't think anyone's doing that very well yet. And our own group, the Christakis branch of practitioners, started trying to do things, just experimenting with different ways of doing things online a couple decades ago. And they were all different manner of trying to do things, from using email to bulletin boards and later wikis. And we tried different platforms that advertise themselves as, collaboration platforms like Lotus Notes, and and then trying to just use things like Hangout or Skype, along with supportive software like the Cognoscope and the ISM software. And I haven't seen great asynchronous approaches yet, but that's one of the focus efforts of what the people in Cyprus are trying to do. Also, Dietrich in Michigan with his Logo Sophia, trying to use, deploy software across the internet. But I'm not sure. Have you seen anyone that maybe other methodologies or other platforms that you think have made some significant progress?
Well, I'll comment briefly, and then I think Helene had some comments. But what I've seen is semantics, and that human beings, groups of human beings, determine semantics from context. And so I believe it's absolutely essential to have people create a common context so they can create a common semantics with the symbols. And in most cases, I believe they have to do that in person. You can do that by having some distributed events and some in-person events, but you have to understand when you're looking at an event, what are the absolute essential concepts that everybody has to understand, and the people have to have a common context to get that meaning. I can give a few examples of where that went very wrong, where large groups of people, but it was, so I think that it's a combination of software and people meeting face to face once they have determined what the specific issues are.
That's interesting, because it's very apropos, this discussion, because I'm just coming out of a meeting for the organization of the ISSS, next ISSS meeting. And the question was actually, how can you keep the dialogue going in between meetings? Because, you have a kind of a climax participation one day a year, and then things start to wither out. Peter had used a SurveyMonkey questionnaire to understand expectations. And so when you said, Joe, send questions out 1 or 2 or 3 times a week, and then maybe convey on a face-to-face type of thing. Well, if we have the video on, it's better. I'll turn mine on maybe while I talk. But indeed, the problem is semantics, because how do you, and this is something I've been running across because I did surveys on patterns, etc. How do you process the text, or maybe at some stage we will be able to do that with speech, that is shared? And especially, how do you deal with the difference in semantics? Because you were saying, Joe, that people need to agree on a set of shared semantics, but my conviction, by looking at, several projects and several initiatives where people were meant to find some shared whatever, wording, vocabulary, vision, values, etc. When you're in an open system, when you're in an open social group where there is no a priori shared something, when people come from different venues, it is, in my sense, a lot of loss of time and probably not possible to reach an agreement on semantics and context a priori before you start anything else. So the process must include a type of mapping of where people are positioned relative to each other and their respective contexts, in order maybe to map a shared context or a greater context than what everyone comes with. And this is where tools also are very important, because and you probably told me that, Kevin, but I'm like very, like Dory in the Nemo movie. I tend to forget stuff. Do you have elements of semantic analysis or text or semiotic analysis in the tools that you are developing? I mean, I'm just throwing all this here, and it's a bit my leitmotiv to say, I think one of the major issue, and the reason probably why things have not come out of the ground, is because there is this kind of unity in diversity type of question that comes up front and hinders lots of processes. I know your tools are meant to solve this, but it's a kind of a catch-22 situation.
Well,
Does it make sense?
Yeah. I think there's a few weeks ago, maybe 4 weeks ago, we were talking about a project I had worked on for the United Nations Democracy Fund called Reinventing Democracy in the Digital Era. And it was going on in half a dozen places around the world, one of which was the Middle East. And we had people from about 8 different countries. And on that project, we used, experimented with a variety of text analysis tools. Now, so kind of falling short of semantic analysis, but we have to start somewhere. And there are tools that do different slices of text analysis pretty well. And one of the things to realize is when you do a structured dialogue, people are generating words at the rate of 4,000 to 5,000 words an hour. And so over the course of 8 hours, you're generating 30,000 to 40,000 words. In a 3-day event, 120,000 words. That's a book. And you can, for example, in Michigan, they and I've been in other events where we did this with the Air Force. We had not speakers, but these conference phones, very good mics that can pick up anyone in the anyone in a big room, and it goes to a group in Kentucky, and they transcribe it right onto the internet, and it's available within minutes of being done, a 2-hour session of the dialogue, and we print it out and hand it right back to the participants and say, this is what we, if you wanted to know what we did. And because it's structured, everything is indexed by who said what is the number of the idea, so people can refer to the number instead of restating the idea. So we have, with that type of simple, these people are court stenographers. That's the skill. Court stenographers, and they have their own tools for, hearing, and they have devices that are faster than typing, right? So that's a kind of the base of getting actual words. If you're not in a live dialogue and people are talking by email or on a bulletin board or a wiki, something like that, people are typing it themselves, which is even better because then they can't complain that the transcription is wrong, right? But once you have that supply of text, there's a lot of tools that can start to do not as far as semantic analysis, although there are some tools that do that, but start to do things like what's the most common words and phrases people use, things like that. And there's other interesting things like phrase nets, which is what's the most common combination of words in a network structure. Very interesting. I showed some pictures of network analysis of the relationship of words in what people had written as the clarification of their ideas, which was very interesting because they had a dialogue, and they also wrote a half to 1 page description of what their idea meant, handed it in, and we put that into the computer. So we had not just the dialogue, but we also had people writing in a more reflective way what was their idea. That's difficult to do if you're in the middle of a dialogue. So that was an interesting combination. And then that text.
Which allows you to kind of understand with a word that's pronounced by two different people if there's a difference of nuance in what's meant behind the word, right?
Yeah. And then another great source is at least what I've been involved with, most any field that you want to have a dialogue about, there's literature that's already out there. And you can look at it and categorize it and just copy the text into these text analysis tools. And, so there's all kinds of analysis just from found data.
What I find is really missing is that I'm not going to say it's solipsistic, but it kind of turns on itself. So you crunch a body, a corpus of data, and it kind of positions the stuff in relation to what's contained in there, but it doesn't relate it to like state of the art or common knowledge base. I found very little, and I'm still looking for a way to network meaning in the sense that like synonyms, like the different meanings of a certain word that you can find in thesaurus, but I couldn't find anything where you could apply it to other types of text, like when you put a body, a corpus of words, can it show the semantic distance between the different words that people use in order to create clouds of meaning or things like that, to compare different things? Because you can describe different shades of gray. It'll appear like different shades of gray, but you'd like to know which shade you have in the end, which shades are the, I don't know if I'm being here. Oh, Kevin disappeared.
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't know if I'm diverging from the conversation here. Oh, he came back.
No, I think that that's very very interesting and a very interesting insight. So we'll just make a couple of comments. One is we did a survey of large governmental agencies that had large facilities, and they had between 15 and 25,000 employees per facility. And we went in and did a type of a dialogue, an assessment type of structured approach on one of them, and it turned out to be fairly good. But it was very expensive. We had to bring people together. They had an approach. There was a part where people met and talked, and they answered questions, and they came up with new ideas, and it was kind of a very structured way. So, but the output from that was very valuable. But again, you had to engage people. They had to get in the same room together. They had to learn from each other, and they had to normalize their semantics during that process.
Yeah, so they position each other. I mean, they kind of compare and confront their own semantics, right?
Right, but so, and that kind of worked. And it kind of worked, I believe, in this large group, because you had like VPs at one level, engineering managers talking to engineering managers, and you had engineers talking to engineers.
Yeah.
Now, the JPL, what they did there was they looked at their folks, they did an analysis, all their folks, and they wanted to find out how many of their technical engineering experts were comfortable at working at very high levels of abstraction.
Okay.
And they found that basically they had less than 3% of their people in their areas were able to work or were comfortable at that level. So if you're going into an unknown situation where ISM is you have a poorly defined or undefined system, so there's no experts in there, but people have expertise, are they comfortable in actually working outside their expertise? Can they work at a high level of abstraction?
Yeah, or transposition, yeah.
Yeah, there needs to be some type of filter to identify just how well these people fit into that role. And then the third thing is that because these large events cost so much money, they did the last event at this place, and they said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to eliminate people coming together and talking. We're going to put this all on computers, and we're just going to have people come together and type these things into the computers when they get time. Just go into the room, answer these questions. We'll analyze it, see what it looks like. And what happened there was it was an interesting facility. It had about 15,000 folks, but there was two groups, two very different groups. One was operational, which they kind of called that group, the operational group, they call them the ranch hands, right? And then the controlling administrating group, they call them the townies, right? And so we had the same questions, and they had totally different meanings for the same word between the ranch hands and the townies.
Yeah.
So when
probably if you had segmented it in finer ways, you would have found, other types of meanings within these two groups, probably. I mean,
what happened is it turned out to be just a random response. The signal that came back was totally random. And so it was useless. And so what came out of that was, you have to normalize. You have to get people talking to each other so they can have some kind of semantic normalization on how much, right? And then are all people, if you have, if you're going to bring in 200 people, how many people in that 200 have the capability of even working at that level of abstraction? Should we give tests to people to figure out who we should select to bring in, right? Things like that.
Yeah, I guess it boils down to, do you make segmentations a priori, or do you get them to emerge in order for them to, to be revealed to each other, so that's a way of getting to some agreement on shared meaning?
Yeah, well, one of the things I really liked about the three languages, the prose, the structured graphics, and the mathematics,
Mm,
was the work that was done in Mexico with the indigenous people. So you had the
mhm,
dominant culture that was, highly literate in all three forms, and then had the indigenous culture, which was basically literate in the structured graphics. They could understand what the pictures meant.
mhm.
And so you could actually develop a shared semantics between the dominant culture and the indigenous people by going forward with the structured graphics and then stopping and having a discussion about what those graphics meant, then going on to the next and going on. So to me, that's the idea of really learning,
Yeah.
right?
Do you have, is there a paper or something on that?
Um, yeah, Roxana Cardenas, I think they did that down in.
Can you put the name so I can look it up in the chat box?
I'll it'll take me a minute to find that, but I will send it out
Okay, great.
on the
Yeah,
list. Yeah,
that's
yeah. No,
interesting.
they when Vicente Fox, when they were running the president of Mexico, had a ISM.
Oh, Vincente. Okay, yeah.
Yeah,
It's because your sound is a bit muffled, so I'm not sure I'm getting the words right.
that's okay. It's okay.
Mm,
All right. So that's
okay.
all for me for now. Kevin, you're back.
Yeah, we
Yeah,
might.
sorry.
Yeah, my connection dropped. We maybe in uh, a future dialogue. I mean, hangout that we do here. It would make sense for me to go over use of repertory grid as an adjunct to the structured dialogue, and I put the spelling of that in the chat box here
Cool.
for you. And the primary references for the software approaches to repertory grids is Mildred Shaw and Gaines. I think they're at the University of Calgary. I've used their material over a decade. And you interview people individually. I could be done in a group, but no one does that. But you do it for the number of different people that are going to be in the dialogue. You ask them what are the basic objects in their, how they view the main objects of the discussion, and then how do they describe them. They're called the constructs. And then you ask people how much each construct's associated with each object, and the software says, oh, people use the same word to mean different things for these two words. I mean, for these two objects, or they call the same thing by different words. So there's there's contrast or conflict or confusion, and it analyzes that type of thing.
Yeah,
But
that's the type of thing I
yeah,
find very useful and could be interesting to apply to body of conversations, in order
yeah,
to make sure that when you read, black on one by one group and black by the other group, it's actually, referring to the
yeah,
same thing.
yeah. The way it happens in structured dialogue, which we're talking about here, is in the context of a clarification.
Mm,
They ask what someone means, right? Someone says, I think this point is important, and here's why. And then people ask them questions, and they say, well, the people asking questions may say, well, that's not what I mean by it. And the
yeah,
facilitator will say, we don't
yeah,
care.
yeah. So it's
We're not
basic.
we're not interested in what you mean by it because it's not your statement. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so it means to reformulate stuff in a way where, like, if you say it in another way, then you kind of you can triangulate the meaning of what you were trying to say, and you get a better understanding of each other's position or language, right?
Yes. But
Mm.
in structured dialogue, they don't try to resolve difference of opinion on what something means. They just try to clarify what one speaker means by their
Yeah, yeah,
statement. And if anyone else disagrees with it, the facilitator says we don't care.
yeah,
You
and
can
I
have
think,
your own you can have your own statement that means something different.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, because the goal is not to uniformize everything, right?
Right.
The
right.
goal is to kind of have a view of what opinions or what, you know, what the where the thing is going, basically, whatever the goal of the thing may be.
Right.
And the tensions that may exist inside it, I guess.
Right.
Mm.
So I'm going to go to the rest of this.
Yeah, sorry, I kind of
agenda. No, not at all. I think though that let me see if I know how to screen share this back.
Oops.
In general, I think there's a lot of tools that have emerged in the past couple decades that are really helpful for the preparatory phase of a structured dialogue, including things, the type of thing that Joe is speaking about, how to do things over a longer period of time, or that you were speaking about, as well as things like text analysis, semantic analysis, personal construct psychology. There's a lot of tools we should talk about.
Is there a place where there's a list of these, where there's a kind of list and maybe review of these different tools? Has anybody
in my computer, my dead computer?
Yes. I mean, is it something that would be useful to the group to kind of see what there is and play with it and test and report? Or
well, there's extreme advances being made almost weekly now in this area. It's very competitive out there right now.
Mm-hmm.
And, one of the things that I've actually put up on the list, I think a couple of times, is the fact that right now you can, with some of the Microsoft tools, you can actually have a large data set and you can type into the screen with text and ask questions of the data set, and the data set will answer it. So it's kind of interactive. One of the fellows that I'm taking a class from at the University of Washington works for the Gates Foundation, and they have an advanced set of that where basically it's voice activated. You can now have conversations in natural language with your data sets. And so essentially that's kind of where this is going. And it's getting there very quickly.
Okay.
Okay, are we
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Do you see the action plan architecture on the screen? Do you see a picture?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, so I'll just kind of sketch the outline of what this is. So the case study with the Patient Safety Foundation I was outlining, this diagram is drawn from them. The logo in the left there, which looks like a circle of people, is actually the logo of the Patient Safety Foundation. But I use that as a model for the playbook here. And the basic model, which is kind of a standard format for doing structured dialogue, is in a 3-day session. You spend a day and a half developing a problematique. That includes outlining problems in response to a triggering question, clarifying what people think are the problems from individual perspectives, clustering what you think are families of problems, and then using interpretive structural modeling, such as the software that Joe is working on, to develop a problematique. And that's what these pictures in the middle are, is just showing the problematique in red. Then the next day and a half, we develop the clusters of actions and their clarification, and then the action plan, also using interpretive structural modeling. And if there's time, people will break into small groups and pick things to focus on that their particular organization may focus on, or they may personally focus on, and they get profiles across the clusters of actions or across the collection of problems that they're going to focus on. And then hopefully that gets turned into an actual project plan when they get back to their office. Now, this is what this is an idealized PERT chart. PERT is a project evaluation and review technique, or Gantt, when you put it in this form. It's what are the activities and the links between them. What has to be done when, so you know where you have some slack and where you don't have any slack. And one of the interesting things from this analysis, what do you think would be one on the critical path, something that you have very little slack about in doing a structured dialogue? Anyone have an idea?
Well, let's see. Looks like
or not necessarily looking at this picture, just from your experience doing dialogues, or what you might imagine from the readings.
well, you have to get set up first. I mean, you're a little slack on that. You have to have your initial conditions, so you got to, whatever the longest is of literature content or stakeholder identification or stakeholder interviews, right? I mean,
yeah,
those are the things that you're pre-event, right? So before you can do the event, which is the longest one of those.
Yeah, we found that setting the date for the event, is one of the most critical things. A second is reserving the room. Because often, if you're going to have 36 people, that's an uncommon room to find. And rooms like that book up months in advance. And you have to find it. It's something that you can put things on the wall. A lot of places you can't put anything on the wall. And this technique, we display everything on the wall. And so interesting, some things like that come out. Let me just go through the rest of the outline. So in here, I mean, this PERT chart shows a 10 activities. The playbook has about 70 major activities, so it's more detailed. And we have a work breakdown structure that you could use. You could take it right from the playbook to present to, if you're writing a grant, and say, this is what we were going to do to hold this event. So people don't have to come up with their own work breakdown structure for a grant. They just take it from the playbook. So we're trying to help them with the fundraising itself. So there's a leadership component, there's a content cultivation or domain expertise component, social network formation activity. There's things about event management, like arranging a reception, and then process design. And that's what the facilitation team is mostly responsible for. But the playbook itself is, for the most part, the process design. And so they're just tweaking it. And then just to wrap up, the activities laid out in terms of the number of weeks before the event. We would usually recommend you never try to do an event with less than 3 months lead time. Unless the people already all know each other, all the participants can walk to the event, don't have to schedule a plane and all that. And so on the left-hand side, you see this is a week, so -12, -8. And these are the activities that should be happening each week. And you see from the on the right is an estimate of how many person hours it should take, or days. And then we divide it up into, is the facilitation team or the consultant responsible, or is the client or broker responsible? Now, in the model that Warfield set up for doing these things, he assigns the link to the client through this role he calls the broker. And what we found in looking at when consultants have trouble doing the dialogue, it's often because the client doesn't accept enough responsibility, for example, to invite the participants. Facilitator's usually not in a good position to invite participants because he doesn't know people specific to the domain unless he's been working in it for a while. And it's the client that needs to invite the participants, but they may not know that. They often want to have the consultant do everything. And so you see how these activities play into different aspects of the architecture here. And then each activity in the whole project is described in terms of why. Oh, hold on. Trying to get to page 40 here. Here we are. So, so 12 to 10 weeks before the event, why are you going to do the following things? Who's involved, what and how? So these are the three main activities. For the first activity, who's the roles? So there's a lead facilitator involved, a process scientist, a researcher, and so forth. And so the second activity and the third activity. So those are the things that need to be done 3 months out. And so forth. And so it goes blocks of time through the event up until the day of the project. And whereas the Handbook of Interactive Management is mainly what happens once you are in the room. There's very little about the prep for the event in the writings of Cardenas and Warfield and Christakis. They talk about what happens once you start talking or once you start using the software. So I'll wrap it up for today.
All right. Well, that's excellent. We're about a minute over.
Thanks, Kevin, and everyone.
Yeah, so April 6th will be the next one. We'll, Mary and I will present the current state of the work on the software and just keep going forward.
Okay.
Thank you, Kevin.
Is it related, Joe, the state of the art of the software, the one you are working on, right?
Yes.
The one that the conversation about the cube that I've been following?
It's kind of part of that.
Okay.
The software is for the augmented interactive management. So
okay.
it'll look at all different aspects.
All right, because I kind of lost the thread of what you were working on, but I'll catch up.
Yeah, we have a couple, 3 different things going on.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank
Talk
you.
to you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.